It began not with armies or bombs, but with a single leak, a quiet line buried deep in a secret telegram. A line so sharp it cut across an entire continent. Hey, the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, backed by the G7 and the IMF, had given Burkina Faso just 48 hours. Either surrender 70% of its gold reserves or pay an impossible debt of $5.6 billion. This was not diplomacy. This was economic warfare, delivered in a suit and tie. But in Ouagadougou, the man who received that ultimatum did not tremble. Captain Ibrahim Traoré read the message twice, set it aside, and said calmly, "So this is how they collected debt poison in a suit and tie." In that moment, the young soldier became more than a president. He became the line in the sand. And here is the question that shook the world. What happens when Africa says, "No, stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It's the future our ancestors dreamed of"? Subscribe and join us for an Africa that no longer bows its head. And here is the question that shook the world. What happens when Africa says, "No, stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It's the future our ancestors dreamed of"? And the story begins on a quiet August morning when a single cable slid across a desk in Ouagadougou, carrying words sharp enough to cut through nations. The cable arrived in silence. No flashing headlines, no press release, no diplomatic handshake. It came at dawn, hand-delivered by a trusted intermediary, wrapped in secrecy and sealed with the weight of empire. On the morning of the 12th of August, 2025, the document was placed on Captain Ibrahim Traoré's desk. Its language was as sharp as the blade of a knife. Buried beneath formal titles and official stamps was a single ultimatum: hand over 70% of Burkina Faso's newly mined gold, or repay the full debt immediately, $5.6 billion, plus interest owed to the IMF. The deadline: 48 hours. Failure to comply, it warned, would bring sanctions, resource blockades, and engineered destabilization. This was not diplomacy. This was extortion dressed as international finance. At the bottom of the telegram was a name impossible to miss: Donald J. Trump. At that time, still holding the voice of the United States, still shaping the decisions of the G7, still pressing the weight of the IMF, the message carried his tone blunt, unapologetic, and cold as steel. "We fed you when you starved. We lent you money. Now it's time to pay." For the people of Burkina Faso, a nation scarred by decades of exploitation, the ultimatum cut deeper than numbers on a page. It was a reminder of every colonial theft, every contract signed under duress, every promise of aid that became a chain. For many across Africa, the leak confirmed what they had always suspected. The wealth beneath their soil was never theirs in the eyes of the West. Inside Ouagadougou, the reaction was swift. Traoré summoned senior ministers, military commanders, and trusted economic advisors. The room was tense, yet his demeanor was steady. He read the letter aloud, then set it aside. "Tell them Burkina Faso is not for sale," he declared. It was not a statement of bravado. It was a line of defiance. Beyond the palace walls, the news spread like wildfire. From Lagos to Kinshasa, headlines blazed: G7 demands Africa's gold. Radio hosts called it a new Berlin conference, an updated scramble for Africa disguised as debt recovery. Markets whispered of instability. But on the streets of Burkina Faso, something else was rising: anger. Yes, but also pride. The ultimatum was supposed to intimidate. Instead, it exposed the arrogance of power. Neutral nations within the IMF claimed Trump was acting alone, not speaking for them. But no one stopped him. Silence was consent, and the silence of the so-called international community revealed the truth. They were willing to let a small African nation be bullied into submission. Yet there was something the G7 did not anticipate. For months, under Traoré's orders, a covert geological task force had uncovered vast new reserves of gold in the north, protected by encrypted systems from North Korean engineers, shielded from satellite surveillance. The discovery was a secret too dangerous to reveal. Until now, Western intelligence had caught hints: unusual shipments from Iran and Venezuela, strange energy signatures picked up from the Sahel. By the time the ultimatum was delivered, they knew the truth. Burkina Faso was sitting on one of the largest untapped deposits in West Africa. And worse, for them, those mines were no longer under Western corporate control. French and American contractors had been expelled quietly, replaced by Burkinabe military units. The revenue was no longer flowing to Paris or Wall Street. It was feeding a national development fund, directed inward, not outward. This, more than the debt, was the real crime in their eyes, a nation daring to claim its wealth, to chart its destiny without permission. The ultimatum was not just about gold, it was about killing the idea that Africa could stand on its own feet. And in the heart of Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré had already decided, if this was the price of defiance, then let the world watch Africa resist. This was no negotiation. It was extortion dressed in the language of diplomacy. But if the West expected silence, they miscalculated, because in the heart of Ouagadougou, one man was ready to turn an ultimatum into a rallying cry. Captain Traoré did not bend, he chose to fight back. The message from Washington was meant to paralyze. 48 hours, no options, no mercy. But in Ouagadougou, fear never took root. Instead, Captain Ibrahim Traoré gathered his closest circle military commanders, political leaders, and trusted voices of the people. The room was silent as he stood, uniform crisp, eyes unflinching. He held the cable in his hand, then dropped it onto the table. They think we are a playground. They think we will trade our future for their coins. Tell them, Burkina Faso is not for sale. With those words, the decision was sealed. There would be no retreat, no quiet concession. Within hours, orders rippled through the government. Contracts with Western corporations were revoked. Foreign mining executives were escorted out under military watch. For the first time in generations, Burkina Faso's gold belonged not to Paris, not to Wall Street, but to its own people. Then came the broadcast. No lavish stage, no grand production. Just Traoré in uniform, standing beside the Burkinabe flag. His voice was calm, steady, deliberate. To the people of Burkina Faso and to our brothers and sisters across Africa, they are not only demanding our gold, they are demanding our fear. To Mr. Trump and his allies, hear this. We are not Libya, we are not Iraq, and we will never surrender our land. You gave us 2 days. Now you have 2 days to take your greed and leave Africa's soil. The speech lasted less than 10 minutes, but its echo traveled far beyond Ouagadougou. Across Africa, radios replayed it, televisions broadcast it, and the internet lit up with one refrain: Africa is not for sale. But if African streets rang with cheers, Western boardrooms seethed with anger. At ExxonMobil, executives warned of severe losses. At the IMF, officials scrambled for a response. At the CIA, analysts red-flagged Burkina Faso as a destabilizing threat. And in Washington, Trump himself was reportedly furious. His ultimatum had been met not with silence, but with defiance. Western media quickly launched their counteroffensive. CNN warned that Traoré was reckless. The New York Times suggested he was leading Burkina Faso into disaster. Fox News went further, branding him unstable and a dictator in the making. Yet, on the streets of Ouagadougou, people laughed. University students remixed CNN's broadcasts into protest songs. Street artists painted murals of Traoré with the words, "Not for sale." The attempt to shame him only strengthened his image. Across Africa, hashtags trended, "Stand with Burkina," "Africa not for sale," and in the diaspora, particularly among African Americans, his defiance struck a familiar chord. Many remembered the civil rights leaders of the past, men and women who refused to kneel, who spoke truth to power. To them, Traoré was cut from the same cloth. The West had expected him to negotiate. Instead, he nationalized. They expected him to retreat. Instead, he advanced. In just 48 hours, a little-known captain transformed into a symbol of continental defiance. And as African newspapers declared, the West demands Africa's gold. Traoré says no. The question was no longer whether Burkina Faso would resist. The question was, how far would Africa go to stand with him? Before long, the answer would arrive, not from Washington, not from Paris, but from Africa itself. The question now was not whether Burkina Faso would resist, but whether Africa itself would dare to stand with him. And the answer came quickly. The sound of engines roared above Ouagadougou, carrying not enemies, but allies, landing shoulder to shoulder with Traoré. The ultimatum had expired, but instead of isolation, Captain Ibrahim Traoré found himself surrounded by brothers. Within days, 3 military planes landed in Ouagadougou. No threats, no fanfare, only solidarity. From Mali came Colonel Assimi Goïta, calm, disciplined, carrying the weight of a nation scarred by foreign intervention. From Niger came General Abdourahmane Chiani, his gaze fierce, his resolve unshaken. From Guinea came Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya, tall, unapologetic, walking with the certainty of a man who knew betrayal but refused submission. Together, they entered the presidential palace. Hours later, they emerged at Traoré's side. Cameras flashed, crowds gathered, and the message thundered across Africa. If you touch Burkina Faso, you touch all of us. It was more than a declaration. It was the birth of a shield. For the first time since the colonial borders were drawn, a bloc of African nations had forged a defensive pact not dictated by Paris, Washington, or Brussels, but by themselves. They called it the Alliance of Sahel States, or AES. To some, it was Africa's answer to NATO. To others, it was the embodiment of a long-forgotten dream. True continental solidarity. In Ouagadougou, people poured into the streets. Drums echoed through the night. Women carried food to the soldiers stationed at the mines. Young men painted slogans on city walls, AES or death. To the people, these leaders were not just politicians. They were guardians of sovereignty, warriors bound by blood and history. The symbolism was powerful. For decades, Africa had been told that unity was impossible, that tribalism and division ran too deep. Yet here stood four nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Guinea, shoulder to shoulder, declaring that an attack on one was an attack on all. Western capitals were rattled. Analysts in Paris warned that the AES could destabilize French influence across West Africa. Washington worried about a dangerous precedent. Brussels muttered about regional instability. But in Africa, the reaction was electric. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, newspapers hailed the AES Pact as a new doctrine. Commentators compared it to the Pan-African visions of Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, and Thomas Sankara. On radio talk shows, callers repeated the same phrase, "At last, Africa stands together." For the diaspora, especially African Americans, the sight of African leaders linking arms struck a deep chord. Many elders who had marched in the civil rights era saw echoes of their own struggle, just as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X had demanded dignity in the face of systemic oppression. These African soldiers were demanding sovereignty against global powers, and among younger generations, the AES became a rallying cry. Online, hashtags spread, AS Shield, Africa United. Videos circulated of students chanting, "One struggle, one people, one Africa." The formation of AES did more than protect Burkina Faso. It shifted the psychological balance. For the first time in living memory, Africans saw leaders defy the West and survive. The notion that resistance was suicide began to crumble. Hope replaced fear. In that moment, Traoré's defiance was no longer his alone. It had become collective. What began as one man standing against an ultimatum had grown into a shield of nations, welded together by defiance and the dream of freedom. The West understood the danger. They did not fear just the loss of gold. They feared the spread of an idea that Africa could unite, resist, and win. For the first time in generations, Africans saw leaders united under one shield, one vow: if you touch one of us, you touch us all. But unity in Africa meant fear in the West, and fear moves empires to act. Behind closed doors in Washington and Paris, strategies were drawn. Yet, before they could strike, new players quietly entered the board. While Africa celebrated a new shield of unity, the halls of power in the West grew restless. In Washington, Trump's advisors warned that Captain Ibrahim Traoré had just rewritten the rules of engagement. At ExxonMobil, emergency calls lit up phone lines, calculating the billions now slipping from their grasp. At CAA headquarters in Langley, red alerts rang out. Burkina Faso was no longer compliant, no longer predictable, and that made it dangerous. Western media launched their campaign. CNN flashed banners. Burkina Faso risks collapse. Fox News declared, Traoré pushes nation toward ruin. Editorials painted him as reckless, unstable, even delusional, but their voices sounded hollow to many Africans, who saw in the barrage of criticism a simple truth: if the West despised him this much, he must be doing something right. Still, the stakes were rising. Satellites watched the Sahel. Drones mapped the gold convoys. Private contractors whispered about regime change. But before the West could tighten its grip, new players quietly entered the board. Within 12 hours of the ultimatum expiring, a Chinese delegation arrived in Ouagadougou. No headlines, no threats, just engineers, economists, and a bold proposal: They offered to build a fully operational gold refinery in 90 days, with technology to process and value gold without passing through Western banks. Even more disruptive was their digital trade platform, a system based on China's digital yuan, bypassing both the CFA franc and the US dollar. For the first time, Burkina Faso could sell its gold on its own terms, free from the claws of old empires. Not long after, a Russian military jet landed discreetly on Burkinabe soil. On board were crates marked special defense assets, advanced anti-drone systems, electronic warfare tools, and advisors trained in countering hybrid warfare. To the west, it looked like dangerous escalation. To Burkina Faso, it was survival. And to many across Africa, it was vindication. The world's great powers were now forced to recognize a small nation's defiance. The response in Washington was immediate. The State Department accused Traoré of selling out to dictatorships. European officials warned of new Cold War lines being drawn across Africa, yet their outrage betrayed their fear. The real threat wasn't China or Russia. It was the possibility that Africa had found alternatives. Inside Burkina Faso, the people saw these partnerships not as submission, but as tools. For generations, the West had framed itself as Africa's only option. Now, new choices were on the table, and the symbolism was powerful. While Western officials scolded from podiums, Chinese engineers broke ground on infrastructure, and Russian technicians installed defenses that made the mines untouchable. Traoré himself captured the mood when he told a gathering of students, "They say we are dangerous because we choose differently, but we are only dangerous to those who fear a free Africa." The global chessboard had shifted. What began as a secret telegram had spiraled into a contest of empires, old and new, played out on Burkinabe soil. But unlike the past, Africa was no longer a silent pawn. It was a voice, loud and unyielding, demanding its place at the table. And as analysts scrambled to predict the next move, one headline captured the new reality. Captain Ibrahim, latest news. Burkina Faso defies the West, reshapes Africa's future. It was no longer just Africa against the West. It was a chessboard where every move risked war, sanctions, or survival. But while diplomats and generals plotted, something even more powerful was rising, not in palaces, but in the streets, on the radios, and across the internet. The people themselves had caught fire. The West had gambled on fear. They believed threats, sanctions, and propaganda would break Burkina Faso's resolve. Instead, the opposite happened. What began as a confrontation between governments had ignited a fire in the hearts of ordinary people. In Ouagadougou, students flooded the streets with banners. "Burkina Faso is not for sale." Young artists painted murals of Traoré standing tall, one hand on the flag, the other holding gold high above his head. Women's groups brought food to the soldiers guarding the mines. Farmers donated grain. Truck drivers volunteered to transport supplies. The resistance was no longer only military. It had become cultural, communal, and deeply personal. Social media turned into a battlefield of its own. Western outlets branded Traoré reckless, a dictator, even insane. But young Africans fought back with creativity. They clipped CNN segments and remixed them into protest songs blasting from market radios. They wore t-shirts that read, "If CNN hates you, you must be doing something right." Every attack from abroad was repurposed into fuel for unity. Across the continent, the spirit spread. In Bamako, crowds chanted "Aïs or death." In Conakry, street walls bore the words, "Our gold, our future." In Lagos, youth groups staged rallies demanding their leaders follow Burkina Faso's example. And in South Africa, students carried placards, "Touch Traoré, and you touch all of us." The diaspora joined the chorus. African Americans, long attuned to the rhythms of resistance, saw in Traoré echoes of the civil rights struggle. Social media posts compared him to Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and Thomas Sankara. One viral tweet read, "This man told Trump, 'Over my dead body,' and lived to tell the story." That's leadership. Pay attention. Churches in Atlanta and Chicago held prayer vigils for Burkina Faso, framing its defiance as a sacred stand for dignity. The reaction stunned Washington. Protests erupted outside U.S. embassies in Nigeria, Kenya, Senegal, and South Africa. Thousands held signs, "Africa is not your minefield. Keep your democracy. We'll keep our dignity." These weren't orchestrated demonstrations. They were warnings, declarations from ordinary Africans that any strike against Burkina Faso would be seen as an attack on all. Meanwhile, Western media doubled down. Fox News warned of a dangerous new Gaddafi. The Financial Times cautioned investors about risk in the Sahel, yet none of it mattered. On YouTube, African creators filled timelines with fiery tributes. On Instagram, clips of Traoré's speeches went viral, paired with Afrobeats anthems. Even Time magazine took notice, publishing a digital cover. The man the West can't bully. Inside Traoré's African uprising, inside Burkina Faso, Traoré himself remained calm. He reminded his people that this was not just about one nation or one leader. The real enemy is the system banks, corporations, and the arrogance of empire. He said, "But together, we are stronger than their greed." And when the 48 hours expired, he made his boldest move yet, nationalizing all of Burkina Faso's gold reserves and revoking every foreign license. The announcement lit fireworks in the streets. Crowds chanted, "He said no. He said no." In living rooms, elders wept with pride. On smartphones, young people posted videos holding soil, fuel, or coins and whispering, "We protect what's ours." For the West, it was a crisis. For Africa, it was a rebirth. And as headlines carried the update, Burkina Faso latest news, a nation reclaims its gold. One thing became clear. The people's fire had outgrown the ultimatum. It was now a movement no empire could contain. The ultimatum had failed. The sanctions had failed. Even the smear campaigns had failed. Because this was no longer only about a captain or a country. It was about a continent reclaiming its voice. And as the 48 hours passed into history, the world realized a new truth. The age of silence was over. Africa had spoken. The world expected silence. Instead, it heard defiance. What began as a single leaked telegram had grown into a continental roar, a young captain standing firm, nations forming a shield, and millions of ordinary Africans rising with one voice. When Donald Trump tweeted in fury, "Traoré just made the biggest mistake of his life. Africa will pay for this," the response in Ouagadougou was not fear, but laughter. Traoré himself looked at the words, smiled, and said, "That is the sound of an empire losing control." For decades, Africa had been told it was weak, divided, forever chained to foreign debts. But in those 48 hours, Burkina Faso proved otherwise. It showed that dignity cannot be bought, that sovereignty is not for sale, and that the future of Africa belongs not to the IMF, not to the G7, not to Wall Street, but to Africans themselves. Across the continent, people whispered a new creed. If Burkina Faso can say no, so can we. And in the diaspora, voices long silenced by distance found fresh pride. Elders saw in Traoré echoes of the heroes they had prayed for. Youths saw a leader unafraid to face empires with nothing but truth, courage, and the will of his people. The struggle is not over. Sanctions, propaganda, and pressures will come. Yet the fire has been lit, and it will not be extinguished. From Mali to Guinea, from Niger to South Africa, from Harlem to Atlanta, a single truth now burns clear. Africa is not for sale. And so, we leave you with this. If this story moved something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak. Subscribe because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Captain Ibrahim latest news is not just about Burkina Faso. It is about Africa's soul. Burkina Faso latest news is not just about gold. It is about freedom itself. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear. Africa Rise.